Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to be starting with just plain vanilla Redux. So I have already created this default project, the boilerplate project, using create React app, Redux banking app. We will not really be using any of the pages or any of the components that are part of the create React app project. We will be simply looking at just Redux on its own. So go ahead and run create React app, create a project, and open up the project in your editor. In this case, I'm using VS Code. Now, in order to use Redux, the first thing I need to do is I need to install Redux. So npm install Redux. That's the package that I need to install if I want to have a global state. So there we go. I've installed Redux. Hopefully you're not going to see these kind of messages. There might be some packages that I have might be old and I need to update, but you will not be able to, hopefully you're not able to see these kind of error messages, or not even error, most of messages. Okay. Now let's go ahead and start the app. I'm going to go ahead and simply say npm start. It is going to start the development server. You can see right over here. This is our basic React application. Let's go to our inspect tool, to the console. We are not really displaying anything on the UI, so we don't really care that much. I mean, you can even hide the whole UI and that should be okay. Now, since we are simply looking at Redux on its own, we will go ahead and remove everything from this particular index.js file. There we go. And in index.js, I'm simply going to write starting banking app. All right. And now if I go ahead and refresh, you can see in the console of my browser, it is saying starting banking app. So we're just looking at Redux on its own. Now we already know that the Redux is the global state. That state is shared with other components. But we don't really have any state to share with. I mean, what are we trying to share? What kind of a state are we trying to share? So let's go ahead and create a default state in which there is one property called balance, which is 0. Now this will be our global state. This means that all the components in the end will be able to look at this state. But right now we're not really dealing with the components for React. We will look into that later, but this is our global state. If we want to increment the state, meaning if we want to change the state, we will create actions. So this is our default global state. State only has one property called balance, which is initialized to be 0. And actions will be the one that will tell someone that, hey, you need to change this state. So let's go ahead and create an action called increment or action increment. The action increment, this is an action, right? So action will have a type. And we're going to go ahead and say increment. I mean, it can be any type. I can go ahead and say increment like this. It's just a string value anyways. And then we have another action, which is action decrement, where the type is decrement. Now we learned earlier on that the only person who is allowed to change the global state is the reducer. We will create a function that will act like a reducer. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's create a function. We will call this account. It will have a state, but if it doesn't have a state, then we can use a default state, and you have to pass in the action also. The whole job of this reducer is to make sure that the state is updated. So the only person in the whole Redux architecture that is capable of updating the global state is a reducer. The reducer has a current state, which is right here, and it will return you the updated state. Reducer is also taking the second argument, which is action, which we have already created. We have two actions. One action is increment and the other action is decrement. Now, inside the reducer, it is a reducer's job to update the global state. Do you think by looking at this reducer that it is updating the global state? It's not. I mean, whatever state that you pass in, it simply just returns that state. It's not updating anything. So let's go ahead and see how we can update the state. So we will update the state based on these actions. If the action is increment, then we will add 1 to the balance. If the action is decrement, we will subtract 1 from the balance. But how do we know that if the action is increment or decrement? Well, if you look over here, you are passing in the reducer, which is called account, you are passing the second argument, and the second argument is of type action. And that action will have a property called type. Type. If the type is increment, then we will do something. And that's the main reason that we have a type property on these objects. That is a mandatory property. If you don't have the type property, then inside the reducer, inside this function, you will never know that whether you were supposed to do increment or decrement. Else if action.type is equals to decrement. Okay, so we have type, we have a check. If the type is increment, we will increment the balance. If the type is decrement, we will decrement the balance. But we're not really doing anything over here. So how do we increment or decrement the balance? You might be very tempted to write something like this. State.balance equals plus equals to 1. And state.balance minus equals to 1. Where state over here is coming from the default state. So it will have a property called balance. I mean, from the looks of it, it looks perfectly fine, right? We are incrementing the balance when the type is increment. We are decrementing the balance when the type is decrement. But there's a big problem with this. In Redux, state is immutable. Immutable means you cannot change the state by adding or subtracting. You have to update the whole state. So immutable means things that cannot be changed. And we are changing the state. We are changing one of the properties of the state, which is called balance. But we shouldn't be doing that. If the state is changing, we should just replace the whole state object with a new one. So how do we do it? We return a brand new object, and in that object we will have a property called balance. We will get the whole state.balance, which is 0, and plus 1 to it. So see what we did over here? We created a brand new object. And in that brand new object, it has a same property as balance, which we have over there also. We get the old state, this is a state, this one, old state.balance, which is 0, and 0 plus 1 is 1. But we replace the whole object. We didn't really change the original object. We replaced it with a brand new object. And the same thing we're going to do over here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. And I will say subtract 1. So that's a very important part of learning Redux, is that the state is immutable. You can't change that. And we are not really changing the state. We are replacing the state with a brand new object. You can see the curly brackets over here and curly bracket over there. We're just returning a brand new object that contains the same property called balance, but with a different value. Now this is all good, but we can also write a little bit more shorthand syntax when we are updating the state. And this can be accomplished by using switch. So I'm just gonna, this is not wrong, by the way. I mean, this is completely fine, but we can also use switch. Switch is a language feature in JavaScript. Switch action.type, and we know that switch have cases. So if the case is increment, then we will return a brand new object, because state in Redux is immutable, with a property called balance, state.balance plus 1. So that's one of the cases. The second case is the decrement. And we will return balance, which is state.balance minus 1. So this is a little bit less code to type in the end, but it is a little bit more clear also as compared to the if and else checks. So we're just going to use the switch statement. All right. So this is great. We have our reducer, which is updating the state. We have our actions. We have a default state also. Now we're going to go ahead and create a store. That's the global store. Import create store from Redux. Okay, so we have created the store. That is perfectly fine. We also need to create the store. We have imported the store, but we haven't really done anything with the store. So let's go ahead and store equals to, we'll fire create store. Hold on a second. Make sure that everything is imported. Create store. And in order to create the store, we need to pass in the reducer. So what do you think is going to go in there? Account. Account. There we go. So now we are passing in the reducer, because if we don't pass in the reducer to the store, then the store will never get updated. Now the store that we have created consists of a couple of different functions. If I want to get the current state of the store, I can simply go ahead and fire store.getState. That's a function that is available on the store object, which will give you the current global state. So let's go ahead and print it out using console.log. Let's go ahead and refresh it. And there we go. We have our state being printed. Balance is 0. So this means that it's working fine. I mean, when we ask for the state, it is telling us that the state is balance is 0. Well, now the question is, how do we update it? Right? I mean, how do we go about updating the balance? Well, we know that we have increment action, we have decrement action. Maybe it's supposed to do something with those actions. Well, in order to perform those actions, we have to dispatch. So store.dispatch, that's another function that is available on the store. And which action do you want to dispatch? Well, let's check out the name of the function or the action. This was action increment. Okay, so we're just going to say over here, action increment. Let's go ahead and refresh it. Okay, so let's go ahead and check the store state, which is store.getState. And we can say over here, initial global state, and we want to print out the state again after the action has been invoked. So after action increment. Okay, let's go and refresh it. All right, so here we go. Initial balance or initial global state is 0. After the action was incremented, the balance turned out to be 1. So it looks like it's working perfectly fine. The global state is actually changing from 0 to 1, and if I fire this again, then it's going to go to 2. Now, whenever the state actually changes, which is a global state changes, the store tells us that the state has changed. It tells us, but we're not interested in that right now because we didn't really write that code. So I will say store.subscribe. Now the subscribe function is going to get called whenever the state is being updated. Let's go ahead and print out what is going on. So every single time you update the store, the subscribe function is going to get called. So let's remove these things and only fire the dispatch. I will refresh it, and you can see that since the dispatch was firing, our state is updated. Now if I add multiple lines over here, increment, 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 so you will see that the subscribe is going to call multiple times, and at the end our balance was actually 5 because we called it 5 times. And not only increment, I mean you can call decrement also. So let me go ahead and somewhere in the middle I can call decrement counter or decrement or action decrement, I think. Let's go ahead and write it correctly. Action decrement. And you can see it was 1, 2, and then 2 minus 1 is back to 1, 2, 3, 4. Great, right? Now one final thing that you can also do is you can attach your store to the window object. And the reason that you want to do that is so that you can use the store, or it is available in anywhere in your application. So I can say window.action increment equals to action increment. And the same thing we can do to perform the action decrement. And the main reason that we're putting it inside the store or inside the window object is that once you put something or assign something to the window object, that is available in all the pages, because window object is kind of like the container in which your application is running. So whatever you attach to the window object, it will be available in all the pages. Now let's go ahead and refresh it again. You can see the same exact result. The great thing about this code is that we are using Redux just on its own. We have a global state, we have the action, and we have a reducer, which takes in a state and return back, or also takes an action and then give us the updated state. So it is the job of the reducer to update the global state. The subscribe function is available on the store, and the subscribe function is going to get called anytime the global state is updated. And you can see that whenever we perform these actions from line number 43 to 48, we are updating the global state, and for each time we update the global state, the subscribe action is getting called, and it is printing out all of those different things. So that is the basics of Redux container, which is used to maintain the global state.